Mocha Bezirgan with Rebel News here in St. John, New Brunswick. And I'm in front of His Tabernacle Family Church. The pastor of this church, Phil Hutchings, is right now in jail.
Warning, censorship.
In front of the courtyard, supporters of the church gathered to pray for their pastor as he arrives to appear before Justice Hugh H. McLennan at the request of Ministry of Health for violating COVID regulations at his church. Current regulations forbid singing inside the church and compel pastors to ensure the enforcement of masks, capacity limitations, social distancing, and to keep a record of every individual who sits on which row and pew number, as well as turning away the unvaccinated humans. This is not the first time Pastor Phil Hutchings appears before Justice McLennan. In the previous court hearing that took place on October 8, Pastor Phil agreed to comply with the orders. But according to Ministry of Health, he did not. The police and officers from the Department of Health put the defiant church under surveillance, arrested one of the pastors on Thanksgiving for not allowing them inside, paid a visit to pastor's home, fined him, and finally summoned him to court for not complying with the agreement. Due to government restrictions, general public and journalists are not allowed inside the court building. This gentleman who witnessed the hearings describes what inspired between Pastor Hutchings and Justice McLennan that day when he signed the agreement.
When we read it, it looked like they said he could have church if he was being reasonable. And he said, I am being reasonable. And he even told the court, but it's not reasonable for you to ask me to ask someone's vaccination status because it breaks federal law. It's not reasonable for you to ask me to ask somebody's medical condition when they're not wearing a mask because it's illegal for me to ask those questions. He said, so I provide masks at the door. I provide sanitization. I have all your signs up. And he said, but people have to have their rights not infringed upon. And he said to the judge, I refuse to break the law to enforce your mandates. And that's where we're at. And now he signed this thing. And according to them, it said, well, you weren't supposed to have church at all. Well, that's not the way it was worded. You weren't supposed to have church in opposition to their orders. Well, their orders were for him to be reasonable, and he's trying to be reasonable, but as many Canadians know, we have got no common sense left in our government, and there is no reason.
The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees certain rights and freedoms, but it also guarantees limitations on them, as long as it is reasonable, that is. Which is not too hard to manufacture when the government is paying hundreds and millions of dollars to justification manufacturers. How reasonable it is to treat millions of healthy Canadians as sick. How reasonable it is to assume unvaccinated as the carriers of disease. How reasonable it is for a health bureaucrat to say in her affidavit that she was uncomfortable due to the COVID risks at this service, when there is no known person infected with the deadly virus is present in the church. How reasonable is that? I asked to Mr. Ken.
It's not reasonable at all. And science, they say they want to go by the science, but what they do is they cut everybody off that has a different opinion than the government, and they'll only allow them to speak.
This isn't the first church being harassed by Canadian authorities. At least a dozen of churches face tough enforcement measures, and a courthouse is no place to seek refuge from government's draconian measures, as a recent ruling of an Albertan judge on a defiant pastor demonstrates. This gentleman who showed up at the courtyard in support of the pastor weighs in.
From a religious point of view, we have them clamping down on the churches now, and they did the one out west, and that man went to trial, and the outcome is preposterous. They are telling him what he has to say. We haven't heard of that only in re-indoctrination, for instance, in China, in Vietnam after the Vietnam War, things of that nature. We've never had a position where people are being told that what they have to say, the words they have to use, and that's part of his sentence.
Pastor Phil walked inside the court building as his supporters were cheering, but he did not walk back out.
judge went basically on a rant and going through all kinds of evidence that he has, when really you don't give evidence if you're not in a hearing, if a hearing's being adjourned. But he just went on a rant of COVID and pandemic and all this stuff. So then he went on this rant, really is what it is. And then he said, well, we're going to adjourn till next Friday. But he said, I've got to take steps to make sure that the orders are being followed till then. So then he said he's remanding Phil into custody until the hearing next Friday at 2 o'clock.
Okay.
So it's a very, when we're in there, it's a very one-sided story. And the judge said he said it sort of appears that it's us against them. It doesn't appear that way. That is exactly the way that it is. It is us, the Canadian citizens, against them.
Did they put handcuffs on Pastor Phil?
They did not put handcuffs on Pastor Phil. He just remanded him in custody and asked the sheriffs to take him away. And he hugged his wife. She was prepared for it. She figured that this was the direction that they were going to take. But again, it's just more manipulation. It's more intimidation.
Pastor Phil will stay in jail until the next hearing on Friday, October 22nd, as the war on freedom continues. We are currently helping Pastor Phil by fighting his fines, and we have offered to help his family with the civil matters, like his contempt of a court order problem that sent him to jail. We want to lift that burden off the family and the church. We really hope they accept that offer. For now, if you want to help us fight his tickets, please go to savepastorphil.com.